Today's video is sponsored by Stamps.com, your 24/7 online post office that's dedicated to saving you time, money, and stress. Stamps.com lets you print your own official postage and shipping labels in seconds, so you can focus on your business. Whether you're running a side hustle Etsy shop, a small office that sends out invoices, a huge warehouse shipping out orders, or you're just someone who spends more than a few minutes each week dealing with mail and shipping, Stamps is a real game changer. As long as you have a computer and a standard printer, you're good to go. No fancy equipment or supplies required. What I love about Stamps.com is how reliable and convenient their service is. Their software lets you access all of the post office and UPS shipping services you need, and automatically selects the best USPS delivery option based on price, package size, weight, and required delivery date. But if you're like me, then the savings are the main draw. Using Stamps.com gives you access to exclusive discounts on UPS and USPS services all year round that you can't find anywhere else. We're talking up to 40% off USPS rates and 76% off UPS. So, if getting the lowest postage rates with the fastest delivery times sounds good to you, head over to Stamps.com/lazymasquerade and sign up for a special offer that includes a 4-week trial, free postage, and a digital scale. Again, go to Stamps.com/lazymasquerade and take advantage of that 4-week trial, free postage, and digital scale. On the 8th of June, 1989, the sleepy suburb of Richmond, Vancouver, awoke to a terrible discovery. The body of Cindy James, a 44-year-old nurse, was found in the garden of an abandoned house. She had been missing for the past 2 weeks. Her hands and feet had been hogtied behind her back, and a black nylon stocking had been tied so tightly around her neck that it had dug into her skin. Despite being found in that position, despite a huge cocktail of morphine, flurazepam, and other substances being found in her system, and despite the victim herself having been tormented by an unknown stalker for the past 7 years, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police ruled that Cindy had taken her own life. The coroner and jury, on the other hand, disagreed and said that Cindy had been the victim of a, quote, unknown event. Still, the authorities stood by their conclusion and closed the case almost immediately. So, what's the truth? Well, let's examine the mystery together. Take a look at all of the strange evidence left behind, and try to figure out who took the life of Cindy James. Cindy's childhood had been fraught with loneliness, what with her father's job constantly uprooting the family and moving them from one city to another, not affording the young Cindy a chance to make any real friends. Her dad was a strict military man, and she spent a lot of her home time doing chores rather than playing with her brothers and sisters. Even so, Cindy had an overall positive relationship with her parents and siblings, but in her heart, she craved for her own freedom, to be able to go out and meet people, to live in one place for more than a minute. Well, that freedom came in 1962, when she moved to Vancouver all by herself at the age of 18. A big decision for someone so young, with no other family or friends to speak of in the city, but one she felt she had to make. It was in Vancouver that Cindy enrolled in a nurse training course. During her studies, one of her tutors, a 39-year-old psychiatrist named Roy Makepeace, took a real interest in her. A romantic interest. Roy was already a married man, so when he and Cindy started their relationship, he made sure to keep everything hush-hush. That is, until 1966, when he both divorced his wife and married Cindy. Scandalous. Cindy wrote to her parents to tell them the good news. The thing is, they weren't even aware that she was engaged. Worried about the kind of man her new husband might be, her parents wrote Roy a letter, accusing him of taking advantage of their young daughter. A letter which Cindy read out to her husband, personally. But Roy was far from a gullible guy, and he quickly realized Cindy had written the letter herself. Why would she do that? Well, it was odd behavior, but blinded by love, he quickly forgave his new wife. So that small incident should clue you in that Cindy had some personal issues going on under the surface. Over time, she started to display more and more erratic and confusing behavior, indicative of her having a personality disorder. For example, she'd start screaming at Roy for seemingly no reason whatsoever, and even confided in her new friends that he was violent towards her, claims that Roy vehemently denied. Eventually, things reached a boiling point, and in mid-1982, Cindy left Roy. Now, divorce is rarely easy on anyone, but since the couple didn't have any children together, the whole process went a little smoother than usual. Cindy moved into her own apartment and tried her best to move on. But this separation was soon to become the least of her problems, when 4 months later in October, Cindy started receiving threatening telephone calls. Calls like this. We'll talk more about that specific recording later. Now, Cindy had just moved into a new apartment by herself, so just one phone call like this would have been very unnerving. But this anonymous caller didn't just make one solitary call. They hounded her constantly, even in the middle of the night. Sometimes the caller would threaten her life, other times they'd just breathe heavily into the receiver and not say a word. After a few days of this, Cindy started to feel like she was being watched, and once when that feeling took her, she closed the curtains in her living room. The phone then immediately rang, and that same dark, raspy voice said, "Don't think pulling the drapes means I don't know you're in there." The caller always addressed Cindy by name, meaning that even though she didn't know who this person was, they definitely knew her. Needless to say, Cindy called the authorities to report what was happening to her. Investigators came to her apartment, but with no leads and nothing to work with, all they could do was tell Cindy to be careful and to start keeping a diary of any future incidents. 3 days later, Cindy and her new friend, Agnes Woodcock, went out for dinner together. They both returned to Cindy's home later that evening and found that the front door was wide open. One of the windows had been shattered, and the intruder had sliced up all of the pillows on Cindy's bed. Whoever had done this had left a front door key on the bedside table. Things were beginning to escalate. In the following weeks, Cindy reported even more chilling occurrences. She said she often heard someone creeping around outside her house in the middle of the night. Her porch lights had been routinely smashed and her phone lines cut. Notes made from magazine clippings like this were left on her front doorstep. Dead cats would mysteriously turn up in her backyard, strung up by wires, with notes attached to them, saying, "You're next." Packages of raw meat were delivered to her address. There was even a time when she found her dog, Heidi, shaking with fear, with a cord tied tightly around her neck. Someone had attempted to strangle her. Cindy was now convinced this person was trying to scare her into an early grave. She reported each incident to the authorities, of course, but the problem was, the perp never seemed to leave behind any evidence. No fingerprints, no DNA, no trace he or she had ever been there. Because of that, the police actually started becoming suspicious of Cindy. They questioned whether she was really being hounded by some shadowy figure, or if she was staging all of this for attention. Well, it's hard to blame them for being skeptical, seeing how these incidents always seem to take place when the police weren't surveilling Cindy's house. The phone calls also only seemed to come when they weren't wiretapping Cindy's phone. Still, perhaps her tormentor was keeping an eye on them too. One of the officers working the case, Pat McBride, regularly checked up on Cindy. He offered to move into her spare bedroom for a while, to make sure she was safe. Cindy allowed him to move in, and as you can probably guess, it wasn't long before the two of them became romantically entangled. Surely with a cop in the house, Cindy's unknown tormentor would leave her alone. Not quite. Somebody continued to sever her phone line. The on-again, off-again nature of their relationship also meant that Pat often wasn't there to protect her. When Pat eventually proposed to Cindy, she ended up turning him down and asked him to move out. They both remained good friends, however. Just 1 month after the slashed pillows incident, the authorities actually spotted Roy, Cindy's ex-husband, parked right behind her house. He claimed that he was just keeping an eye on his ex-wife, making sure that she was okay, but also confessed that Cindy had no idea he was outside the house. Roy later asked Cindy to move back in with him. She turned down his offer. One night, in January 1983, Agnes went over to Cindy's house, only to find her outside, crouched down, with a nylon stocking tied tightly around her neck. Agnes helped her get it off so that she could breathe, and a clearly terrified Cindy explained that while she was walking to the garage, someone had crept up from behind her and tied the leggings around her throat. In all the confusion and panic, she hadn't gotten a look at her ambusher's face and only caught a glimpse of his white sneakers. After that night, Cindy moved to a new house, painted her car, and changed her last name. For a brief time, things quietened down, and Cindy thought her nightmare was finally over. She took a vacation to clear her head, de-stress, and celebrate. When she returned, she found yet another handmade note at her place of work, which simply read, "Welcome back." Unsatisfied with the police's investigation, and fearing that she wasn't being taken seriously, Cindy hired a well-respected private eye named Ozzy Caban. Ozzy gave her a two-way radio since her phone line was so often cut, and installed the panic button in her home in case of emergencies. He promised to keep her safe. Thing is, even Ozzy started to doubt Cindy's version of events. He noted that she was rather evasive and knowingly withheld information from the police. Some people, including her parents, believe she only held back information because the perp had threatened her family and she feared for their safety. Ozzy's doubts about Cindy were quashed one night in 1984 when he heard strange sounds coming from the two-way radio he had given her. It sounded as if she was struggling with someone. Ozzy immediately jumped into action and drove to her home. He found Cindy lying in the hallway. There was a sharp blade stuck through her hand, pinning her to the floor. A note stabbed through it simply read, "Now you must die." Her pulse was weak, but she was still alive. When she finally regained consciousness, she told detectives everything that she could remember, which wasn't much. Someone had stuck a needle in her arm, and then everything went black. Tired of Cindy's imaginary drama, the officers didn't even bother to take fingerprints. What was the point? Her attacker clearly didn't exist, and she was obviously lying. Ozzy Caban, on the other hand, was now fully convinced that Cindy was telling the truth, believing there was no way she could have done all that to herself. Cindy's family concurred. They believed that her tormentor was a smart man who knew when to keep his distance and when to strike. Whoever he was, he wanted the cops to think that Cindy was losing her mind, and by doing so, really was driving Cindy to insanity. Well, if that was true, then his plan was working. Cindy, now suffering from extreme anxiety, was committed to Lionsgate Psychiatric Hospital, where, after 5 days, she was deemed to no longer be a risk to herself and was released. She moved house again, this time to Richmond. Despite the intensity of the previous attack, things were only set to get worse for Cindy. On December 5th, 1985, she was found half conscious in a ditch, 6 miles from her home, wearing a man's work boots, rubber gloves, and not much else. Cuts and bruises covered her entire body, and she was suffering from hypothermia. Again, a pair of pantyhose were wrapped around her throat, the calling card of her tormentor. She had no memory of where she was or how she got there. That was it. Cindy's friend, Agnes, and her husband, Tom, started staying overnight at her house, so that the overstressed and overtired Cindy could finally get some sleep, free from worry. For a few months, things cooled off, but in April of 1986, they heated up again. This time, literally. Agnes and Tom were sleeping at Cindy's house. They awoke from their slumber to find the downstairs rec room on fire, the phone lines severed, and the panic button disconnected. They ran outside to wake a neighbour to call for help. Standing at the curbside, just outside of Cindy's house, was a man. "Call the fire brigade," they shouted. But rather than help them, the man mysteriously ran off. There was no sign of a break-in, however, leading police to believe that the fire must have been started from inside the house, most likely by Cindy. Tom and Agnes said that was impossible. Their friend would have never endangered their lives like that. In May, Cindy said that she had had enough of the threats and that she was going to end her own existence. It was the only escape. All the anguish, flashbacks and nightmares were just too much to bear. As such, she was again hospitalized and put under watch. During that time, she was diagnosed with a multitude of disorders, including schizophrenia, paranoia, and psychopathy. In October, her ex-husband, Roy Makepeace, received a disturbing phone call. Specifically, the one I played for you earlier. Two weeks after Roy received that ominous message, Cindy was found comatose and hogtied in her car, with no memory of what had happened. Electrical tape had been used to cover her mouth and restrict her breathing, and Cindy later confided in her sister that she thought her mental functions had been impaired due to a lack of oxygen. Her limbs had all been tightly tied behind her back, and a knot expert said it would have been impossible for her to tie herself into that position. Still, tired of Cindy's constant pestering, the police didn't look into the incident any further. In fact, they stopped giving much thought to Cindy's calls and reports for the next 3 years. May 25th, 1989 was the day Cindy disappeared. Agnes had gone to her house that evening, but Cindy wasn't inside. Strange, seeing how they had agreed to meet. Not long after that, Cindy's car was found in a shopping mall parking lot. Inside were freshly bought groceries, a wrapped gift for her friend's child, and a recent bank deposit receipt. Blood was found on the outside of the driver's side door, and items from Cindy's wallet were found under the vehicle, suggesting there had been a struggle. 2 weeks would pass with no sign of Cindy anywhere. Then, on the fateful afternoon of June 8th, a blue-collar worker went to the yard of an abandoned house just 1.5 miles away from Cindy's home. Lying in the grass, he found Cindy, her hands and feet hogtied behind her back, and a stocking around her neck. Only this time, she wasn't breathing. Far from it. She had been dead for the past 2 weeks. But she hadn't died from strangulation. It was a cocktail of substances injected into her system that made her heart stop. Though there was a needle mark on her right arm, there was no evidence of any paraphernalia at the scene to suggest that she had done this to herself. The detectives ruled that she had either intentionally taken her own life or had accidentally done so while setting up one of her staged attacks. Like I said at the start though, the coroner didn't agree. So, who was right? Let's start by analysing the murder hypothesis. Tying your hands and feet behind your own back and then pumping yourself full of morphine seems pretty unbelievable, so surely someone had done this to her, right? Well, that's what Cindy's friends and family believed. So too did Ozzy Caban, who said it would have been impossible for Cindy's body to go unnoticed for 2 weeks. The entire yard was visible from the roadside, so in his mind, someone must have dumped her there after taking her life. The absence of any implements at the scene also suggested that someone other than herself had injected her. Assuming that person was somebody Cindy knew, there are really only 2 main suspects here. Her ex-husband, Dr. Roy Makepeace, and her ex-boyfriend, Pat McBride. Roy certainly had a motive. Cindy had left him after all, and it was no secret he wanted her back. It's certainly suspicious that all this torment started just 4 months after he and Cindy separated, and the fact that he was once caught parked outside her house without her knowledge Well, that's definitely noteworthy at the very least. Not to mention, Roy was a doctor. He would have had access to the morphine, flurazepam, and other substances used to sedate Cindy. His psychiatric knowledge would have also helped him play mind games with both Cindy and the investigators. However, when Cindy secretly recorded a conversation she had on the phone with Roy, accusing him of being the tormentor, Roy convincingly denied any involvement.
Are you denying it?
Oh my God. I am certainly denying it. I always have denied it. I have absolutely nothing whatever to do with it.
So, if it wasn't Roy, how about Pat McBride? It's possible he made all the threatening calls as a way to get close to the woman he was infatuated with. Knowing she'd called the local authorities for help, he could have made sure that he was assigned to the case, and knowing that Cindy was in a vulnerable position, planned to offer to stay with her. He may have still been infatuated with Cindy after she turned down his proposal and broke up with him. As a policeman, he would have known how to hide all the evidence of his activities, how to stage the scenes a certain way to influence the detectives and make them think Cindy was crazy. He also would have known when the cops were surveilling Cindy's house and phone, and therefore when to strike. Then again, perhaps it really was a stranger that had just become obsessed with Cindy. Obsessed enough to leave chilling messages like this. But let's listen to that recording again and pay close attention to the voice. Does that sound like a man to you? Sounds more like a woman trying to make her voice sound like a man to me. Which leads us to the second possibility. That for 7 long years, Cindy had reported hundreds of staged incidents to the police, had put her life at risk numerous times to convince them there really was a tormentor, and then, either intentionally or accidentally, ended things in an extremely elaborate and mysterious way. I mean, it kinda makes sense, right? After all, it's hard to believe that over the course of 7 years, the perp didn't make one single wrong move or leave behind any usable evidence. Perhaps that's because the perp was Cindy all along. And, most disturbingly of all, maybe she didn't even realize it. It's possible that Cindy suffered from dissociative identity disorder and had a split personality. She may have genuinely believed someone was tormenting her during her blackout periods, not realizing she was actually her own stalker. It's clear that Cindy was a very troubled woman, but was her mental decline the result of an unavoidable psychological condition, or was it due to all of the stress and anxiety caused by a real tormentor? Now, more than 30 years later, the question remains. Is somebody in Vancouver getting away with murder? With no definitive answers, we're left to ask ourselves, what's more haunting? The prospect that somebody did this to Cindy, or the thought that she did all of this to herself and didn't even know it? A huge thank you to all of my supporters here on YouTube and over on Patreon, especially my biggest supporters. That One Guy Thomas, Jessie Jug, Alex Greensall, Azrael Warakai, Beatrice Matarazzo, Charlie Lackey, Colin Monsma, Connor Louthan, Crawford K. McDonald, Expand Ong, Gina Valera, Gracearchie, Infamous-senpapi, Leonardo Martinez, Logan Perkins, Mackenzie Griffin, Myra Lancaster, Monica Mendoza, Nadine, Natalie Escobedo, Peter Lolgeraj, Philip Westra, Precupidine Natter, Sarah Ramirez, Taylor&Monica Gruenk, The Only Dorita, Zane, Ms. Crypto, Damien Bennett, The Deck of Cards, TNS Mum, Hamish K, and Lydia Glassley. Thank you guys so much for your continued support, it really helps the channel out. Be sure to smash that like button or I'll smash you, and you'll be hearing from me again very soon. Until then, you all stay spooky. And remember, the best things happen in the dark.